I'm Towns Duncan. I'm here on behalf of the Nashville Bar Association Oral History Project to interview Brad Reed, who just recently completed his 50th year at Bass, Berry & Sims. Brad, if you would state for the record your full name and date and place of birth.
John Bradbury Reed, born December 15, 1939 in Nashville.
So as a native Nashvilleian, you've seen a lot of changes. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your family, growing up in Nashville, your education here, and that sort of thing.
Well, let's see. The first place I went to school was Miss Ruby Bashrieg's kindergarten, which is on West End Avenue, just about exactly where the Dairy Queen is now, just past Murphy Road. Then I went to Ransom School for the first 4 years of elementary school. And then we moved out. We had lived in an apartment during the war when Dad was overseas. And we, several years later, moved out, and I went to Palmer School for the 5th through the 8th grades, Montgomery Bell Academy High School. Nashville just grown from being a little town to a big town. We would ride our bikes most anywhere, and our parents would send us off downtown on Saturdays, and we'd go be on our own, riding the bus. Nobody seemed to be worried about anything. It didn't seem to be anything to worry about. It was just a much smaller town then.
And then you went to MBA and then to Duke to school?
Yeah, went to Duke to college.
Okay. How'd you come to leave Nashville and go to Duke?
Well, I guess like a lot of kids, I knew I didn't want to stay in Nashville for school. It didn't have anything to do with Vanderbilt. I just wanted to get the hell out and see some other part of the world. I think I was probably intimidated by going east, and so I wanted to stay in the South. I've always sort of thought of myself as a Southern boy, and Duke presented itself, and the acceptance process back then was a little different from what it is today. My friend Jody Wallace and I went over there during spring break of our junior year, and they said, you're fine, you're accepted. So that was how I got accepted.
Actually, a brief digression before we dive into the substance of the interview. I think it's probably safe to say that your family tree contains a slightly more exotic ancestor than most that are going to be in this oral history series. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your supernatural ancestor?
My 7 times great-grandmother, Mary Perkins Bradbury, was convicted in 1692 of being a witch at the Salem witch trials and sentenced to be hanged. But the sentence was not carried out, and it's not entirely clear why not. The main story seems to be that her townspeople, she was from, I think the biggest claim to fame that she had as far as historians looking back on it was that she was from a long way. She was from more than 40 miles away from Salem. I think she was the most physically remote of the people who were tried, and as over the more recent years people have tried to figure out just exactly what was going on in the witch accusations, there appeared to be a fair amount of grudge settling going on, and I think she was her case was part of that theory. But anyway, supposedly the townspeople came and took her out of jail. The whole witch trial caper was only over about 4 or 5 months, and basically the state came in and put a stop to it.
That's interesting.
So anyway, she lived 8 more years.
Justice is done. And again, before we go into your legal career, let's talk a little bit about the sort of broader context of the times in which you have practiced law. You sort of came of age or got through college in what were turbulent times, a lot of changes. So just talk a little bit about sort of major social, economic, political events and how they impacted you.
You know, they were turbulent times. I I don't know that I'm proud to say, I just really wasn't part of them to any great extent. When I was at Duke, I was active in student affairs, and of course no Southern college or university was integrated then. And I was interviewed and asked if Duke ought to be integrated, and I said, well, you know, of course. You know, why don't you talk about something hard? And so my nickname my last 2 years was the N-word, more in jest than in opprobrium, but I felt that I had kind of wasted my college years. I'd had a little too much experience around John Barleycorn and related things, and so I was.
You did make Phi Beta Kappa.
Yeah, but that was kind of a last-minute push just to see if I could. Let's just say that I didn't have a good, solid, balanced life when I was in college. I was either working my tail off or partying my tail off, with the more of the form of the latter in the earlier years. Anyway, I came to law school, and I started in the fall of '61, which was not so much turbulent times, but I was angry at my what I felt like was wasting my time in undergraduate school, and so I really worked hard in law school. I think I outworked anybody just because I was mad at myself. I graduated in '64, still a little bit early. Kennedy had been assassinated in November of '63. Civil rights legislation was passed in '64. But you know, what I was concerned with at the time, as I say, I'm not really proud of this, I was concerned not passing civil rights legislation, but passing the bar examination, which I took in June of '64. The bar exam, the first day of the bar exam was, my oldest child was born about 4 o'clock in the morning. So that was one of my own little experiences. And I know there's a question about military service. And there were, you know, all kinds, I mean, some people served their country well, and there were all kinds of I don't know, charades might be too strong a word, but different ways of trying to avoid the military. And I just sort of sailed through. There were student deferments in the early '60s when I was a student, and then there were deferments for being married a little later after that, when the student deferments were knocked aside. And then there were deferment for being a parent after being married was no longer a basis. So I just sort of, you know, I went from trying to be a good, hard-working law student to trying to be a good, hard-working lawyer. And I just really wasn't, you know, I was aware of what was going on. I worked with Mr. Bass on a lawsuit that arose out of the riots in North Nashville after Stokely Carmichael spoke at the at Vanderbilt's Impact Symposium. I think that was '67. It may have been '68.
'67.
And so I was involved in a lawsuit coming out of that. But you know, I just wasn't, the various disturbances that were going on during that time over Vietnam, which were of course related to how close somebody was to being drafted, I just sort of missed it.
Turning to the law, and you've obviously talked about being a hardworking young lawyer, but how did you, I mean, you came back to Nashville for law school.
Yeah.
And was there any decision process there, or was that just sort of?
You know, it was, well, I don't know. If you had lived in Durham for 4 years in the time that I was there, you would have developed a true appreciation for Nashville, because it was awful. I was dating a girl who was at Wellesley and so I went up and looked at Harvard Law School, and the faculty members were really nice, and the students were just, it just felt like a snake pit. I found out why, gosh, not more than 5 or 6 years ago, but I felt like it was a meat locker, and I've always, valued community and kind of a sense of we're in this together, let's see if we can't help each other out, and that just really turned me off. So really by elimination, I came back to Nashville.
Just out of curiosity, you said you found out why 5 or 6 years ago. Why? As respects to Harvard.
The law school at Harvard was the only school that didn't have a quota on Jewish students back then. That's one of the things that I think, us non-Jews don't have any level of awareness of that kind of discrimination. But so what happened was there was a very large percentage of the class at Harvard who were, first generation immigrants from Jewish families, and whose families' livelihood, welfare was going to depend on how they did in law school. And so it was a place where the competition was tough and cutthroat. That's the explanation that was given me by a Harvard law student who's a lot older than I am, but who had been there many years before and was familiar with it.
Interesting. So you did well in law school. How well do you think your legal education prepared you for the process of lawyering when you got out?
Well, if I had gone into trial work, it would have prepared me almost not at all. But I did very little trial work, and so the academic part of it was great. Vanderbilt under Dean Wade was a really good school, and they hired a number of emeritus professors from the Ivy League law schools. The two principal ones when I was there were Eddie Morgan teaching evidence and Elliot Cheatham teaching conflicts of laws and the profession of law, and they were wonderful teachers, wonderful teachers. Mr. Morgan was old and hard of hearing, and everybody thought he was losing it. In fact, when I worked really, really hard, I would realize that where he began a class was where our reading was supposed to end. And since, it was pretty rare for anybody to work hard enough to see that, everybody thought, well, he's just wandering off in the ether somewhere, talking about things that don't have anything to do with the concepts that we're dealing with. But he was great. And Mr. Cheatham was just a profound gentleman. So my law school experience was very good. Dean Wade was a fabulous teacher too, and I felt that I'd learned how to research pretty much anything, and not trial practice, no, but I don't know that law schools then were thinking that that was too much of their responsibility.
After law school, you did fairly quickly, I think, start teaching at the law school as well.
I did. Our class was the first class our class was 2.5 times as big as the class before us. The class of '64 was 2.5 times as big as the class of '63. And that growth occurred because of the decision to build the new law school. Mm-hmm. And there was a little bit of a, if you build it, they will come, Field of Dreams aspect to it. So Dean Wade found himself in a position where his administrative responsibilities just sort of exploded. The school essentially tripled in size in 3 years. And so he had to cut back on his teaching load, and so he asked me to teach one of the courses that I had taken under him, and I taught that for 8 or 9 years.
Restitution?
Restitution, yeah.
enjoy that experience?
I enjoyed it a lot. I've always been a lot more interested in concepts than rules, and concepts that sort of are exceptions to rules. And restitution dealt with, you know, situations where something unfair had happened and the usual remedies wouldn't reach the fact situations, and the courts developed various theories to try to grant relief. Mistake, fraud, just unjust enrichment generally.
Yeah. Turning to your legal career, you recently celebrated your 50th anniversary at Bass, Berry & Sims.
I did.
And gave a nice talk, which I was honored to attend. Talk a little bit about how you came to join Bass, Berry & Sims, and maybe a little bit also about the firm you joined at the time you joined.
Well, I had clerked at another firm in Nashville both summers, but Russ Morris, who was in my class and had been a football star at Vanderbilt and was just really a good guy, had worked at Bass, Berry & Sims while we were in law school. And when I was a senior, trying to decide where I was going to practice law, I at first looked at some other places, but eventually decided I want to stay in Nashville. And when that happened, I had an offer from the other firm, but Russ sort of started recruiting me. And Jim Bass and Warner Bass were, Jim 2 or 3 years older than I am, Warner 2 years younger, were guys that I had known growing up and liked a lot, thought the world of, just thought they were fine people. Jim was already practicing law, and Jim was smart as a whip. And Warner was a Moorhead scholar at Carolina, and you know, it just looked to me like these were the kind of people I'd really like to be associated with. So I decided to go with our firm.
And talk about the firm. What was the firm? Where was it? What did it look like when you joined?
Well, the firm was founded in 1922, so I've been there a little more than half of its existence. The original founders were General Frank Bass, general because he'd been Attorney General, who had died during World War II, and Frank Berry Sr. and Cecil Sims. I think I'm right in saying that the firm of Bass and Sims had been formed in 1918 or thereabouts, and Mr. Berry joined the firm. It became Bass, Berry & Sims in 1922. Mr. Berry was in poor health when I joined. I got to visit with him a little bit, but never got to do any work with him. I don't think he did any work after I had gotten there, and he died maybe in January of '65, so it was early on. Mr. Sims, on the other hand, was still doing a fair amount of work, and Mr. Sims had, excuse me, had taught the professional law class at Vanderbilt with Elliott Cheatham, and so you know, we realized Mr. Sims was a character, and he was quite a character. So I actually got to spend a fair amount of time with him and work with him on one particular matter in some detail. Actually, I ought to add, I got to do a lot of work for Vanderbilt. Mr. Sims was the trustee of Vanderbilt, and I guess he was their general counsel at the time.
I think you would say he was their whole legal department at that time.
Well, they didn't have a legal department.
Right.
But I think there were some other lawyers who were on the board, and so I'm not exactly sure that our firm did all of their work, but we did most of it, I think. And so I got to work on some really interesting projects sort of in the bowels of Vanderbilt during the first few years. And
then you, I think you have described the current Mr. Bass, the son of the founder, as a mentor of yours, and you want to talk about how you worked with him and how he helped you develop as a lawyer.
Yeah, it's more by osmosis than anything else. You work with somebody, you observe his habits, You can't fail to admire things done well, and you try to emulate them. That sort of would be my, that was a formula that applied to me with Mr. Bass. He was great. He's still there, by the way. I celebrated my 50th anniversary essentially the same day he celebrated his 80th anniversary with the law firm. He's been with the law firm for 80 years now. He turned 104 last month. And he comes in every day.
We should all aspire to that. Then so talk about how the law firm operated at the time you joined it. I mean, departments like they have now or not?
No, not at all. I guess the lawyers had some degree of specialization, but we were all doing, I mean, utility infielder is a term that I've used. I think it's generally used. We all did whatever came in the door. And of course, since Russ and I had zero seniority, we did essentially what we were told to do. So sometimes that was an opportunity, and sometimes that was something less than an opportunity. But the things were very different then, just from I guess you'd call them generally technology. But this was probably, the 60s may have been the height of smoking. Everybody in the law firm, I think, smoked. Everywhere. You just smoked. I guess I quit a couple of years after I started practicing law. I don't think anybody ever thought it was good for you, although apparently the cigarette companies advertised that in the 40s anyway. I can't remember whether we had just started keeping track of our time when I started, or whether we started doing that shortly after I did. But the idea of billable hours was just in its infancy. And things were a lot more relaxed. We'd have about a 30-minute coffee break, 10 o'clock in the morning and around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and all the lawyers in the building, not all, but a lot of the lawyers in the building would come. We were in the American Trust building, which is at the southwest corner of 3rd and Church. We had the 10th floor. Waller had the 12th floor. Bolt had the 7th floor. Manier had the 4th floor. Goodpasture, Carpenter, Woods, and Courtney, which I think probably doesn't exist anymore, had the 6th floor. Warfield and Entrican, back then Charlie Warfield and Irving Entrican were partners when they were young lawyers. Charlie then went over and joined
Ferris Warfield.
Yeah, it was Ferris, Evans, and Evans, right. And it became Ferris, Warfield, and Evans. And Evans originally, but ultimately Canada.
Canada, right.
And then Izzy Schulman, and let's see, the firm was Schulman, McCarley, Hollins, and Pride. Louis Pride, who was a great character, was in that firm, and I can't remember what floor they were on. But anyway, people who were available, lots of them would come down and we'd sit and talk and swap stories. And it was, things just were collegial in a different way. I mean, even intra-firm now, the firms have now gotten so big and everybody's so concerned about billable hours and everything that the collegiality, I think, has unfortunately suffered.
Probably so. So you have for the most part, I think it's fair to say, been a business and transaction-oriented lawyer, securities lawyer, for most of your career. But sort of as you said, your days as a utility infielder, you do have some sort of interesting litigation and appellate experience. It might be useful to get on the record in this interview.
It's odd that somebody who is just a about as close to a pure business lawyer as you can be. But started back then. I got to argue a case before the United States Supreme Court. It was a habeas corpus case. I got to argue a case before the Tennessee Supreme Court that I was appointed in, which had to do with the spousal privilege and testimony. And I argued a couple of cases in Cincinnati in the Court of Appeals, and argued before the Tennessee Court of Appeals, and did a little bit of trial work, mostly at the General Sessions level, which was, you know, a real trip, but it was probably where my abilities suited my work. But I kind of fell into being a business lawyer. I started in the summer of '64, and two of Woody Sims' clients decided to go public very shortly afterwards. I had taken a course in securities law. My senior year at Vanderbilt was the first time there had been taught a course in securities law at Vanderbilt. And I took it, and that made me ripe for grabbing hold of, yeah. And so I did a lot of securities work.
Do you remember who the clients were?
Sure. One of them was Martha White Foods, which made Martha White flour, which I'm sure is still around. They've been through a lot of iterations. Most recently that I know of, they were bought by Beatrice. But I don't even know if Beatrice is still around. And then the other one was a life insurance company that was formed by the owners of a very successful life insurance agency that was a client of Woody's, and the name of the life insurance company that they chose as a startup was Forest Life Insurance Company, and that ultimately was, I don't know, in a decade or so later, acquired by Willis Caroon, or one of the big agencies. And the Willis office here, I have no idea whether they still have any of the business from back then. But in any event, you get to do public offering work, and you have to draft the documents to do that. It was an interesting time as far as securities law is concerned. The successful real estate developers in Nashville in the late '60s were putting together syndicates and selling partnership interests, and they said, well, of course this isn't a security, it's an interest in real estate. And it took some time before I don't know that anybody got in any real trouble, but before they realized that it is a security. But securities laws were very arcane and specialized at the time. So I'm
sorry.
Go ahead.
No, and I think you had mentioned at one point that that when you started doing work as issuers counsel, that the practice that had grown up was for the underwriters counsel to actually draft the registration statement, notwithstanding that it was not a document that came from their client.
Yeah, that was when I kind of moved to a higher level as a securities lawyer. The New York firms that represented the investment banks would prepare the registration statement, and then the issuer's lawyer would be called on to give an opinion that included that the registration statement was true and correct in all material respects. And a federal judge somewhere said, no, hey guys, you can't have the underwriter's lawyer preparing this document and the underwriters being able to rely on the opinion of the other party's counsel when they know the other party's counsel didn't have anything to do with it, didn't know anything about it. So all of a sudden in the late '60s, that created law business for people like me, and the first one of those that I got was with Kentucky Fried Chicken, and that proved to be great good fortune for me.
Talk about that, because is that the genesis of your relationship with Jack Massey?
Yeah, and I didn't even know that Jack Massey was my client. The little background, KFC had moved to Nashville after Mr. Massey and John Y. Brown had bought it from Colonel Sanders in the early 60s. And in, I think, the fall of 68, John Y. tried to hire Jim Bass as general counsel for KFC. He turned him down, and then John Y. tried to hire me as general counsel, and I wasn't interested in that either. But not long afterwards, John Y. called and said they were about to do a public offering, and he knew I did securities work, and would I please do that? And this was in the context that their New York firm for their underwriters had done all of their public offering work before, but then this court ruling came in and made that no longer feasible. So I was, working hard on that, and it had a lot of interesting twists and turns to it. But it turned out that at the last minute that the seller was not the company, but was Mr. Massey. And that was sort of kept secret because the idea was if Mr. Massey was selling out of KFC or selling down his interest in KFC, then that might not be received well by the market. And so they had to kind of get things ready for that. And so I'm doing all this work without knowing that I'm really representing a particular selling shareholder. And I had never met Mr. Massey before the connection with that. But I started doing a good bit of work for him after that.
I mean, talk a little bit about, because he was a significant, his various interests were a significant part of your legal practice for a lot of years.
Yeah, well, he was in the venture capital business before it was called venture capital. And he had a partner, John Neff, who was, who worked together with him, and Lucius Birch came to work for him, I think, in the late 60s. And so they would, they were doing deals, and I got to work on a number of their deals, mainly acquiring, relatively small going businesses, trying to build them up into something more and sell them.
And then did you also represent Hillsborough Enterprises?
Yeah, I did a lot of work for Hillsborough Enterprises. That was really, in a sense, that was my the most fun I had was working with them because
talk about who they were.
Okay, well, Hillsborough Enterprises was a holding company that I wasn't around when it was created. It was already going. It had 3 owners at the time that I was introduced to it. Sam Fleming, who was the president of Third National Bank, Lipscomb Davis, who was the president of Davis Cabinet Company, and Stuart Campbell, who was a very successful real estate investor in Franklin. These guys were really fine people, very well respected in the business community. And they had, over the years, they had originally a financial partner who I'm sorry, I don't know which one, but it was one of the National Life families, who I think probably put in the seed capital. And they, by the time I got involved, owned significant percentages of a number of banks in the area, rural banks, and other business enterprises. So it was a holding company, and I worked with them, really with Toby Wilt, who somewhere along the line came in and became the chief operating officer. Toby was Mr. Fleming's son-in-law. Toby did a fabulous job for Hillsborough. I mean, he created a lot of wealth in building up these various businesses and selling them. And Toby was one of the few clients who thought it was a good idea to sit down with a lawyer, in this case me, sort of well in advance of facts evolving that might produce business opportunities, and trying to decide how to respond in those various fact situations. And that proved to be, at least in that business, a good thing to do, because there were lots of opportunities that came along. The other thing was the three families. This was a regular old corporation, and the three families were trying to do some estate planning, and they couldn't just split the company up and in a tax-free fashion at the time. And so what we did was sort of recapitalize it so that as each of the three died, his interest would be redeemed for certain assets. So it was kind of like 3 times a holding company, and each one knew what he was, what his interest was in. And that was, I don't know, that was fun to do. It was fun to work on and try to make sure everything was done in a fair fashion to everybody. I think it worked out very well.
You mentioned one of the NLT families being the financial partner. You had some involvement with NLT in a variety of contexts, including when they were ultimately sold to American General. But in the run-up to that process, you took a trip to Omaha and had some conversations that, had they turned out differently, might have been interesting for Nashville.
Yeah, that would have been, it's funny. I knew at the time that was a potential game-changing opportunity, and it didn't work out, which was unfortunate. But American General and National Life were each behaving in a hostile fashion toward the other, with the idea that one of them was going to take over the other, and neither one of them wanted to be the one who was taken over. And I had met Warren Buffett a couple of years earlier in a completely unrelated context, but I knew from talking with him that this might be the kind of thing that he would be interested in. And so Bob Walker and I talked about how we could investigate this without running any risk of doing anything that could damage the credibility of our client. So I made what was in effect a secret trip out to Omaha. Our client, National Life, or NLT, didn't even know about it, to discuss with Buffett the possibility of his getting involved on National Life's side.
Sort of as a white knight, or
well,
maybe that term didn't really exist then. But
the transaction would probably have involved not his buying the interest in NLT that was owned by American General, but his buying some kind of preferred security in NLT, and the proceeds from that would then be used to buy back the NLT stock owned by American General. It's the same kind of transaction he did 6 or 7 years later with Solomon Brothers. Anyway, so I went out and had a nice talk with him, and one of the things he said, if I were to do this, I would have to insist that I take over the management of National Life's investment portfolio. And I think that Berkshire, which was his investment portfolio, Berkshire Hathaway at the time, the stock was at $500 a share, and it's now about $194,000 a share. And that's probably not a terrible proxy for what could have happened with NLT. But in the event, anyway, we met. He had some interest, wasn't sure. Walter Robinson went out. Walter was the CEO of NLT, and it didn't work out.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it was nobody knew about it. In fact, I'm not sure anybody knew about it until I talked about it a couple of months ago, except for the people who were involved in the transaction. But it was a real disappointment to me.
Yeah, would have been interesting. So I guess another area that has absorbed a lot of your time is, I think the phrase you've used is business divorces. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is just sort of by happenstance, but generally, I mean, my generic observation is that family businesses are a curse because the patriarch wants to keep the business in the family after it shouldn't stay in the family, and you get all kinds of unfortunate and unpleasant relationships among siblings or cousins as the generations pass. And so there's a lot of opportunity for to represent disgruntled shareholders in privately owned situations that are either, they're always closely held, they might be 50-50, or they might be a, majority and significant minority. But the very first one I did of that, in fact, was for Toby Wilt and Mr. Fleming. Michael Corzons in Green Hills. Michael Corzons was originally in the 60s bought half by Toby and half by Michael Corzon. And they had a little shootout agreement which said that, if at any time one of them decided they wanted out, he'd name a price and the other one would have to buy or sell one or the other. And so, in a sense, I've been doing that forever, but probably in the 80s I started doing it, more of it. And the problem with it is it just gets incredibly nasty. I got word in one that somebody's going to get killed. And, ultimately you'd rather be a healer than a destroyer. So if I work in that area nowadays, it's pretty much on the condition that I'm going to try to make things work out in a non-adversarial way. Adversarial stuff is fun, but ultimately it's not very satisfying.
Right. Sort of circling back a little bit to your relationship with Mr. Massey, which continued for a long time and I know continues to this day, but one sort of, I think, pretty heavy chunk of your time was spent maybe somewhat as a lawyer and somewhat as a businessman with Maryland Farms. A lot of that time after Mr. Massey's death, but on behalf of his estates.
Yeah,
tell us about that.
Almost all of it was after Mr. Massey's death. Mr. Massey was one of very few people, one of very few clients who said to me early on, I want you to tell me if you ever think that something I'm doing is too close to the line. I don't want to get on the wrong side of doing something that's wrong. And so that was I took that as a compliment that he would have that kind of confidence in me. Maryland Farms was a situation which, by the time of Mr. Massey's death, he owned very little interest in because he had transferred his ownership interest for the most part to various members of his family. I think that originally Maryland Farms had 5 partners, probably something a little different from this, but 20% partners is about the way it was. And Maryland Farms, now you go out there and you think, golly, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. But it was very slow to develop, and it had a lot of stop-starts to it. And then in the 80s, it experienced a fair amount of success, and the guys who were running it, all of whom were, I think, completely honest, nice people, made the mistake of thinking that it was their investment brilliance rather than that fabulous piece of real estate that was the cause of the good fortune that they were experiencing in Maryland Farms. And so they took a fair amount of the undeveloped land at Maryland Farms and mortgaged it to raise a lot of cash. Then they distributed the cash to themselves, perfectly legal, nothing wrong with it at all. And then they took the proceeds, took that cash and reinvested it in various projects, commercial projects, even I think 1 or 2 residential projects elsewhere than Maryland Farms. And that proved to be just a total disaster. Part of it, I think, was because of the real estate recession. Everybody remembers the real estate, crash in 08 and 09, but there was a horrible real estate recession in 1990, 91, and Maryland Farms got caught up in that. So not long after Mr. Massey died, I was one of his executors, and in fact the other 2 of his executors were involved in Maryland Farms, so I was kind of having to do that myself. They had a whole lot of debt coming due, and I asked them how they were going to get that refinanced, and they said, "Oh, the banks will refinance it." And I said, I'd be worried about that, and they said, "Well, what do you know about it?" So 9 months later, they were all in individual personal bankruptcy, and we had to write several $1 million worth of checks to cover Mr. Massey's share of guarantees of debt that he had made. So I spent a lot of the 90s trying to get back the investment that he had involuntarily made, or that his estate had involuntarily made in Maryland Farms, and it worked out. It worked out fine in the end. It's always easy to say in retrospect, well, that had to work out. But I'm telling you, when you were in the middle of it, it didn't have to work out.
It worked out pretty well.
It was scary. It worked out very well. It was scary. Yeah, we got all the money back and a fair amount more. But, look at Detroit. Everybody's, Maryland Farms was it was a farm. And it didn't have to work out that way.
Yeah.
But fortunately it did, and we've benefited from it.
Yeah. So those are that's some interesting and some largely positive things in your career as an attorney. Talk about what are some of the more difficult and unpleasant things you've sort of done or had done to you as a lawyer.
The worst thing by a mile you've heard me talk about was when this was 30-something years ago. Well, you have to give a little background to it. This was actually a company that Mr. Massey was one of several investors in, and it had bought in the late 70s a company that owned and ran a coal mine in West Virginia. And that didn't work out very well, so a few years later, they entered into negotiations to sell the coal mine back to the guy that they bought it from. And this was not a big transaction. I think the total price, if it was $1 million, it wasn't much more than that, and it may have been less. But in any event, the transaction was long and difficult, and in the end, I think he made a down payment but couldn't make the next installment, and then it turns out that he had borrowed the money from a New York bank and given them completely fraudulent financial statements to get the loan. And the bank was trying to figure out how they could recover their money. I mean, he was an empty sack, and they weren't going to get anything out of him. And so they somehow decided that the parent company that had sold this coal mining subsidiary back knew about the fraud. Not only did they know about the fraud, but they had put him up to the fraud. And not only was it the parent company, but it was the parent company's lawyer, me, had put him up to all this. So here I am, out of the blue, a lawsuit alleging, that it's just a civil lawsuit, but the allegations were, criminal fraud in all caps. And there's a big article about it in all the Tennessee newspapers, in the New York Times, full-page article in the business section of the Sunday Times, big article in the Wall Street Journal, big article in the Financial Times of London, all naming me as being sued for fraud. I'm telling you, that was the worst experience by a factor of 10. And I'm not sure what the psychology of this is, but, knowing to a factor of 100% that I hadn't done anything wrong at all, that this was just nonsense, and that eventually it would be, that would be sorted out, as it was a couple of years later, that didn't help at all, because you get all this horrible publicity, and there's not going to be any corresponding exculpatory publicity. That's not going to happen. That's not the way news is made. So that was the worst thing in the world, but that was really personal, and it all worked out in the end. Well, I don't know that it can work out okay, because when everything was dismissed and I got an apology, essentially no publicity about it. The most frustrating thing that I was involved in law practice involved a corporate investigation, an internal investigation of a client who we were pretty convinced, and the independent accountants were pretty convinced, that there was that there were rats in the barn, and that there was some bad conduct going on, and the top executives of the company resisted and resisted and resisted, and ultimately they were successful in getting the investigation called off, just, we thought, as the wrongdoing was coming to light, and the implications for who was engaged in the wrongdoing were going higher and higher and higher up in the company. But anyway, the investigation was, the top management convinced the board to stop the investigation. We resigned as counsel. The whole audit committee resigned from the board. I think the independent accountants resigned, but nothing ever came of it, really. I think one guy ended up going to jail, but I don't think any of us who were involved in it were satisfied at all that the operative facts came out. That's probably the most frustrating thing.
Yeah. Well, so you now sit and look back 50 years. Talk a little bit about how the city's evolved, Bass, Berry & Sims has evolved, the legal profession's evolved, with some, and don't fail to talk about your views about law firms and marketing.
Oh, well, everything has grown so much. I don't really know where to start on that. When I was studying law, the idea of lawyer advertising, and you can distinguish between marketing and advertising, but it's not going to be a legitimate distinction, was just forbidden, and it was unethical. One just didn't do it. Nowadays, it's just turned 180%, and you have, it seems to me that you have sophisticated marketing and unsophisticated marketing, but it's all contrary to what I learned as the way that a lawyer ought to behave. Lawyers, he ought to develop his business based on the quality of the work that he does, and the word will get out. I don't know whether that's possible anymore, but it's not. We're not going to know because there ain't anybody trying it now. Mm-hmm. The firms have got, when we started practicing law, it was not unreasonable to think that everybody who joined the firm would stay there for a long time. And the idea of coming in for a short period of time and being well trained and then sent out in the world to do well somewhere else, that was limited to New York. It seems to me like there's a lot of that going on in Nashville now. Things have just gotten a lot less collegial, a lot more dollar-oriented. You know, I think most of the time I sound like an old fogey, and so I, you know, probably just ought to be quiet about that.
Would you recommend somebody go into the law today?
You know, Towns, I wouldn't know. I don't think I have any concept of what it's like to be a young lawyer now. I mean, when I started, I thought it was an honorable profession, that you could help people do the right thing. And the idea of going into law to make a lot of money, that was just, it was one part of it. You didn't do that. Same thing was true.
So you didn't starve.
Same thing. No, that's right. That's true. My starting salary in today's dollars was about $45,000 a year. I'm not sure what the starting salary is now, but it's north of 100,000.
Yeah, it's got 6 numbers.
Yeah. No, it was a way to make an honorable living, but not get rich. The same thing was true of the practice of medicine. It was Medicare is what started doctors toward, you know, becoming so conscious of the dollar. I say that because I stayed in Nashville largely because because of a very small number of friends, one of whom was an orthopedic surgeon who died last year. And, you know, we just sort of marveled at the way our respective professions had changed over the years. But, you know, everything else has changed too. So, I wouldn't tell somebody not to be a lawyer because it's not the way it was when I started, because nothing's the way it was. A whole lot of things didn't exist. So I don't know.
Mm-hmm. You feel, is there an ongoing culture at Bass, Berry & Sims that you can sort of see some continuity? Or do you feel like things have been sort of lost?
I wouldn't say that things have been lost, but it's there, and our law firm makes a very conscious attempt to maintain the kind of culture of mutual support. But when the economic realities are sort of staring you in the face all the time, it's very hard to do that in a credible way.
Yeah. Sort of going back over the same 50-year period, you know, when you weren't practicing law, talk about the sort of community activities and things that have meant something to you, that have absorbed some of your time, things you're pleased to have been involved with.
Well, one that was sort of related to the practice of law that I really am proud of was I was active early on, very early on, with what was then called Legal Services of Nashville, now the Legal Aid Society, which was a very controversial organization to begin with.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. It was vigorously opposed by what you would call the more conservative element of the bar. Mostly it was the older element. They just thought it was outrageous that poor people would be given free legal services. I never understood the argument, but that was what was made. And the first director of legal services was a nice person, but not very effective. I went on the board not too long after, and not immediately after, maybe 2 or 3 years after it started, and I had I think a significant role in hiring Walter Kurtz, and that just completely transformed it. I mean, Walt just did the best job you could imagine and created a wonderful culture that was then carried on by Ashley Wiltshire. You know, Walt and Ashley were the executive directors combined for, I don't know, what, more than 30 years.
I would think yes. Yeah.
So I was very proud of that. I mean, you know, our firm is a big business firm, and you know, so I've always sort of had to, you know, like the little guy's side. Education is the other area that I probably have devoted more time to than anything else. I have been on the trustee of school. I did a good bit of legal work for NBA when Nick Carter was the head, and that was fun because I thought he was wonderful. I was pretty active in church for a period of time, not much now.
You were chief warden at Christ Church for a while? On the
I was a
Audience.
senior warden a couple of times.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
my bad.
That's good enough. I'll take chief.
And then the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. Anything to?
Yeah,
talk
yeah.
about
I
that?
was. Yeah, I should have mentioned that because I am very proud of that. The Tennessee Higher Education Commission originally, well, this is sort of like a lot of other things. Its biggest asset, arguably its only real asset, was its credibility. It was created in order to bring fairness into the funding of higher education. In the 60s and early 70s, Andy Holt, a name you may remember, who was just a hugely popular president of UT, would come down and get out of the legislature anything he wanted, and any crumbs left over would go to all the other educational institutions in the state. And so the Higher Education Commission was created to try to make funding fair throughout the system based on objective standards. And it was formed, I think, in '67. I went on the board in 1980, I think, and served pretty much the whole decade of the 80s. And I was really proud of it. There was some great people on it. Louis Donaldson was on it, Walter Armstrong, both of them really fine Memphis lawyers. It did a first-rate job. And then, as I was going off, as always is the fear in an organization like that, whose asset is its objectivity, it became politicized, and it was very greatly politicized a few years later. And I haven't followed it in the last 20 years simply because it lost its interest for me.
Well, to sort of come to the end of this, talk a little bit about what you're up to now, projects that you have yet to complete that you want to complete.
Well, I'm still working with Mr. Massey's trust, charitable and family, and that takes up some time. I'm working on one big project now, which is the winding down of what had been a very large privately owned company that got into trouble and then sort of hopeless insolvency because of an unfunded pension liability. And I think I'm winding up the 8th year, could be the 9th year of that now, but we've negotiated a settlement with the PBGC, Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation in Washington. It had a similar situation with an English subsidiary that we've just gotten resolved, an unfunded pension liability. And just trying to get something for the owners of the business instead of having them wiped out. It's fun to do. Yeah. And it's a little bit, it's like Maryland Farms. In fact, I think I got hired because of the Maryland Farms experience. I really, sort of prefer working on things as principal, and you don't get to do that very much as a lawyer. So this has been fun. I've got, the CEO has confidence in me, I hope justifiably, and so I kind of make decisions.
So do you see yourself retiring ever, or do you see yourself sort of continuing to work on projects?
I think the world is probably retiring me. I mean, you know, since I don't engage in any marketing, you know, if you think of well, there are a lot of things that are like a bell curve, a normal distribution, and I would say my law practice is, and the only question is how close it's going to get to the x-axis, and it's getting pretty close to the x-axis now. I don't, you know, not that much I'm doing now. I still like fooling with projects. They're all, you know, they're just little puzzles to be solved, and but my guess is that I'll be retired, not in any unpleasant way, but just because, you know, you wake up one morning and you look at the business and there ain't none.
Well, I don't know about that, but we'll see, I guess. All right, the second to last thing I've got to ask you is there anything else that you'd like to tell us?
No, I mean, I will mention, you sat here, you know, Mr. Massey stole you away from me. Towns was, he was a young rising star in the law firm and went to work for Mary Bers, and that was 30 years ago, 29 years ago. But no, I'm happy to answer questions, but I ain't got a lot to volunteer.
All right. Well, and then I guess the last question then, I suppose, is, you know, I tried to come up with something witty and didn't. So I'll just ask you, how would you like to be remembered? You know, if you know, 50 years from now, if somebody's talking, what you know, what are the 25 or 50 words you'd like to have them say about you?
Oh, I think I'd like to be remembered as an honest, competent lawyer. That'd be good enough.